Today, in this episode of Product Bytes, we talk with Phil Corson. Phil is an expert in product-led growth. And Phil, it's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
To get started, can you give us a little introduction about you yourself? In particular, what have you done, and also what led you to a product management career?
As you introduced me, my name is Phil Corson. I live in Saskatchewan, Canada, which is a province right in the middle of Canada. So if you don't know, it's just very flat. And I have been in product management and growth for about 10 years now. I jumped in. I was very fortunate. Someone took a chance on me, and I realized this is what I want to do for the rest of my career, and I've been in it ever since.
What are 3 things that you are passionate about?
Music. So I'm a musician myself. So I play bass and keyboard and some other fun things. And I'm passionate about my family. I have a 3-month-old, and so new family and growing, and we have a wiener dog as well. And so I'm really passionate about our family and the things that we get to do together. And then third, I'm passionate about my career in product-led and product management. And so I read a lot of books, and I try and stay up to date. I don't want to be that stale old leader one day that's completely out of touch with what's the current thing going on in product management. So I try and stay up to date as best I can.
So since you mentioned that, let's jump into product-led growth. Can you give us like a quick overview? What is product-led growth?
Absolutely. There's a lot of definitions floating around on the internet, so that it's open to interpretation. But the simplest way to summarize it is it's using the product itself for scalable and sustainable business growth. And when you think about how you can actually apply that, there's about 4 levers that is commonly used as a terminology in product-led growth: is acquisition, activation, monetization, and retention. And when you think about those levers, you're thinking about how can you use the product to achieve those outcomes for the business. Can you use the product to more effectively acquire users, to more effectively activate them, to achieve their aha moment and want to buy your product, ultimately more effectively monetize them. If you've ever experienced a paywall in software, that's product-led growth. And retention, that one is probably the most commonly one associated with more traditional product management, where you're building features that continue to make your product sticky, but also continuing to remind your customers. So if you've ever, like I always use the example with Spotify, they always send that end of year kind of, here's all the music you listen to. That's a very product-led way of thinking about your growth and retaining your users and showing that they're getting value. So that's a really good kind of retention growth example.
So from acquisition to retention, there is a funnel, right? And it looks like in product-led growth, you want to cover each one of these areas so you can use the product to help the business grow. Now, in that funnel, are all the stages important? Is like acquisition the same as important as retention, or should you focus more on one versus another?
It can be visualized as a funnel, but typically it's visualized actually as a cycle or a circle with an entrance and an exit. So an entrance is your acquisition. So what's your hook that's going to get you inside your product-led growth flywheel? And then ultimately you want a very small exit. You want a low number of customers churning, obviously. And so what I've typically found is every company that I've worked with, every company that I've consulted, it's always been different as to which motion and which lever is the most important to pull in a given quarter or 6-month or 12-month period.
And you mentioned the 4, what did you call it? The 4 pillars?
Pillars, levers. Everybody uses a different term in the industry, but yeah, I use levers. Yeah.
Levers. Okay. So you mentioned the 4 levers in product-led growth. Can you give us a little bit, maybe an example for each one of them? What typically a company or a product team does to support each lever?
It depends on the maturity of the product itself too. Usually earlier software companies are naturally product-led because they're resource constrained. They don't have the budget to hire salespeople. They can't really target mid-market because of the complexity and the deal size. So very commonly, new startups will be focused on SMB, and naturally, you will gravitate towards a product-led growth motion, whether you're aware of that or not. So that's the first part. The second part is when you think about the 4 levers. Good examples are within acquisition. You might actually use specific components of the product. So I'll use Oyster as an example. We had a ton of free tools that were in the product to help you understand global benefits, how much will it cost me to hire this employee. There's all these tools that we built, calculators, converters, currency, all these things that we built, and we exposed those so that users could find them. So when you typed in how much does it cost to hire someone in Spain, we would show up and it would be a tool that our product team built. It wasn't, some landing page that a marketing team built. It was like, yes, they built those pages, but it was ultimately that product value that they were getting. When it comes to activation, most people have engaged with activation in some way. You sign up for a product, you go through a sign up flow, there's tooltip, there's prompts, there's encouraging nudges for you to get to some sort of aha moment. And the companies that do it really, really well will try and get you to that aha moment as quickly as possible in that activation cycle. So there's Miro is a really good example. You can sign up for Miro and get value from a whiteboard experience within like we're talking like 1.5 to 2 minutes. And so you're understanding like, wow, this is amazing, and you want to use it. And all of a sudden you're activated, you're getting value from it. Monetization, I gave an example earlier, but I'll give an example here. Whenever you've encountered a paywall, that's a case when the product was playing a role in the monetization efforts of the business. So the product is doing a good job of saying these features are on this plan and it costs this much. And when you want to interact with this feature, you can't yet, and there's a paywall and you might need to talk to somebody, or you can just put down a credit card and you can upgrade. And those are really good examples. And then, like I said, with the retention one, a really good example is the Spotify one, where at the end of the year, they're reminding you of how much value you're getting. I've seen B2B companies do this actually quite well. HubSpot does one where they say, how many email campaigns did you do? How many, what was your average conversion rate? Kind of like this summary, year-end summary. I've always grown fond of those ones because they just really remind you that you're getting value, and what you're paying for, you're getting value from.
This seems to be a lot of, let's say, marketing concepts or marketing terminology. So now the product manager or product owner is also becoming a marketing specialist. How do the two work together?
That's a great question. I've noticed, at least as the role of product management continues to evolve, I've noticed that there's becoming more vertically integrated kind of ownership pillars within product management. And so you start to see more specializations like technical product managers, integration product managers, growth product managers. You can kind of see their backgrounds and how they are informed into the actual specialization. So typically you'll see an engineer or a very technical person just naturally gravitate to specializing in that work. And so one thing I've noticed within growth product management is, you're right, there's a lot of marketing principles, there's a lot of measurements, there's a lot of funnels, there's a lot of conversions. So typically you'll end up, and I do have a marketing degree, and so that kind of naturally gravitated to, hey, I'm doing this product management thing, to, oh, if I apply these marketing principles on top of product management, it's a whole nother effect that you can build using the product itself. So that was kind of the dots that were connected for me. But you are right, there's a lot of marketing principles associated with product-led growth.
How is working in a product-led growth? How is it different from like a traditional environment or maybe an agile environment?
Good question. The thing I'll stress first is it's very difficult for you to be an accomplished product-led growth practitioner without understanding the fundamentals of Agile or Scrum or iterative working. And the reason I say that is because if you walk into this idea of growth hacking or this idea of like moving fast at all costs, you're going to make some very serious, potentially egregious decisions for the business because of this mindset of moving quickly. But one thing I've found, at least in my career, is understanding the fundamentals of Agile and Scrum allowed me to understand the principles of iterative work, getting continuous feedback in a set period of time, and integrating that feedback into the next piece of work that you do. And that's actually what I've done in product-led growth. I've just overly simplified a lot of those workflows, because a lot of the work, you're prioritizing problems more than you are bringing well-developed user stories to teams. You're actually bringing well-developed problems, and you're kind of solving, I call it solutioning in the open, or you're kind of solving in the open as you go. And I've seen many different flavors of how you want to execute with a team, but I'm happy to go into it, but I've developed a framework that's worked quite well, I think. given my continued success.
That would be interesting to hear. Yeah, what is the framework?
So what I've done is I've taken the concept of the Scrum loop, and I just call it a learning loop. And so what's really important within the team, and when you have a Scrum team, velocity is a very important measurement to understand if you're becoming a high performing team. I've just added a prefix and call it experiment velocity. And so what's really, really important within a product-led growth team is that you are continuing to move fast. And that's the number one KPI that I've always had for growth teams, especially growing the growth teams, is it doesn't matter if your experiment is a success or not. What matters is that you're continuing to evolve and be higher performing and running more and more and more experiments with the same number of resources that you have. Because the math checks out that 90% of the experiments you run are either not going to work, or they're not going to deliver the impact you were looking for. But it's that 10% that you want to get to. And so the more of them that you're doing with that mindset of understanding, how do you make sure you're empowering a team? How do you make sure that they have the information that they need to execute? And then how do you evolve the learning that you get from that experiment that you run? So I've kind of mapped out different roles. So you kind of have like a driver on the team, you have a statistician on the team, someone that can analyze data, you have a code writer on the team, so someone who can write code, and you have a marketer, someone who can think about what's your growth strategy, what's your go-to market, all that. And the thing I stress with a lot of folks that I talk to is that it doesn't have to be all specific people. That can be the skill sets of multiple people. So I've worked in a team of 4 before, and we shared some of those capacities and skills, and we're able to execute on that. So this framework of moving quickly, measuring experiment velocity is super, super important. And the cornerstone of an experiment is I've established a rubric. And one of the things I've noticed, especially in kind of scale up organizations, is there's kind of an uncertainty of like, are we scaling in the right direction? And also comparably and equally in super large organizations, there's a super big desire to make sure that the work and the resources you're allocating is adequately resourced. I've established a rubric that essentially, instead of just saying, here's my hypothesis, which is using the scientific method of if something, then that is the result. Many teams will set a hypothesis, they'll set some sort of arbitrary success metric. And then when the experiment has concluded, they'll debate back and forth as to whether or not the success was actually and fully achieved. And so what I did is I took it back with a couple of folks that I worked with, and I said, let's build a model that preconceives or uses our biases or our information that we have to preconceive what we think the outcome of this experiment is going to be. It's your hypothesis, but it's a more concrete way to document it. And so what comes out of that is you have a hypothesis. If something, then this will happen as a result. And it's typically some sort of product interaction that you're about to go on and embark and try building and see if it works, helps some sort of business problem you're trying to solve. But then I'll set a default action criteria. So if this experiment is a success, we will leave this experience in the product. Or we know that what we're building here is really hacky and we shouldn't leave it in. We're just learning here. So the default action, well, we're going to take it out. Then you have an alternative action and an alternative action criteria. So the criteria might be the conversion rate drops by more than 2%. And if the conversion rate drops by more than 2%, your alternative action criteria already tells you what you're going to do next. You're going to remove this. You're going to iterate. That's the next experiment you're going to prioritize. You're going to iterate and try that. And the reason that I built that framework was because then it didn't paralyze teams as soon as experiments were concluded, and they weren't constantly, checking an experiment rubric. It says, hey, we're going to check this in 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, we're going to have a reminder, and we're going to look at the rubric, and we're going to look at the results, and we're going to know exactly what we're going to do next. We're going to run an experiment. We're going to kill this out of the product. We're going to do whatever we're going to do. And it just became that much quicker to really accelerate the learning and the experiment velocity of teams. So that framework of kind of using Scrum, taking out the pieces, and like I said, you can take out as many pieces as you want. Some teams I've actually used sprints still, like we had a 1 week sprint. Some teams will actually be more burn up or Kanban, and that's the best way that we can work. So it really depends on the flavor of the team and what they want to do. So it's less about kind of the tangibles of how you're executing, and it's more about what can we keep trying and experimenting both in our process and the things that we're building to ultimately achieve that experiment velocity of shipping as many as you possibly can, still with that quality and working software mindset of the Agile Manifesto. Like, you have to make sure that fundamental is there to know that you're not just shipping really bad experiences that users may not like, that kind of growth hacking mindset that I mentioned before.
And then you mentioned the 10% success rate. That's what you want to get to. And the faster you get there, the better it is for the team, right?
That's right. And those 10%, when you're moving at a really fast clip, which I had before with teams, you end up getting caught off guard by those 10% that work. So I've had where we took out a step in a flow, and it, for some reason, created a astronomical increase in conversion rate and didn't affect detrimentally the end of the funnel either. And so all we did was test taking out this page. And some people were on the fence. They're like, I think we need this page. Some people didn't. So I said, well, let's run an experiment. Let's take the page out, see what happens. And we decided we don't need the page. And everybody's opinions, I wanted the page. I was one of the people that said, this is a good page. It helps get the information we need from users. We took the page out, had no detriment to our bottom of the funnel. So we said, page stays out. And you see some other ones where we changed some positioning of a pricing page, and that increased ARR with 95% confidence by 1.5%. Like, we just changed some, but like the other ones that we worked on that we thought were really going to knock it out of the park, they didn't work. So it's all about like that learning quickly and realizing, and you're not going to have some, nobody has a crystal ball to know that, oh, if I change this copy, it'll, really make an impact for the business. You just need to be running enough experiments that you'll get those every, 8 or 9 experiments that you run, you'll get one.
Because if you knew, you would have done that before already, right?
That's exactly right.
So it looks like to instill all these practices of product-led growth, there is also a change in culture that needs to happen within the team or the organization.
The best way to understand is the company ready for this type of growth mindset. There's I'm blanking on her name, but she wrote the book, The Growth Mindset. Very good book. Highly recommend it. But if you feel that the leaders of the business are afraid of failure, you know that you're in a space where you need to tread more carefully. If there is a more open sense of the culture and the willingness to try new things and an encouragement, and there's no feeling or sense of consequence if I tried something and stepped out in the open and failed. So I'll give a good example. At Oyster, we had no real experimentation framework. We had no context of running experiments. And so I worked with our COO to kind of craft an experiment framework that said a little bit simpler than the one that I worked on product growth, but was totally empowered and wanted to circulate within the organization. If you want to run an experiment, let's say you're a support team and you're finding that there's gaps in how you can support, and Fridays are really high backlog days and people are working overtime. That team is empowered to run an experiment and try and change maybe the shifts that the teams work to try and optimize. Maybe Thursdays people work a little later, and so then the support leader can try running an experiment, and we implemented a safe way for them to have a framework to say, this is what it is, this is what I'm doing, this is how long it's going to run for, this is what I hope to have happen. And we wanted to kind of build that up, and that was right when I joined at Oyster, to try and help build that concept of an experiment, having that bigger safety around failure, and it's less about failure and more about learning, and then ultimately crafting guardrails so that people aren't taking such large steps of experiments that it's too high risk for the business. So it's all about more of those smaller iterations of experiments, and it is saying, we want to buy this piece of software and try building this thing and go, and I'm like, that's a 6-month in debt. Like, no, that's not an experiment. That's what an experiment tells you to do. And so let's take a step back and see if we can run an experiment to say we should do those things.
Now you're poking my curiosity. What's one example, one story?
So what I've done, I've consulted companies before that are looking to be more product led and our sales led. And it's typically either older businesses that have existing growth motions. They have their own working race car. Reforge uses a race car for a growth analogy. The race car already works. So it's really hard, or an airplane or any analogy, to really change that vehicle while it's moving. And so it makes it really difficult to challenge the status quo. And so what I've done, either as I consult or myself, is as soon as I step in, I go talk to that sales leader, I go talk to that finance leader. It doesn't matter if I'm a product manager or, just a lowly associate product manager. It doesn't matter. You can put some time on the calendar. Most leaders will actually accept an invite, and so just kind of pick their brain. What's the biggest problems you're facing today, and what's some of the things that you're seeing. And when you find one of those nuggets, I call them, if you find a nugget that this salesperson says, I'll give one example. There was these 3 tools that a sales team was using, and it was really inefficient how, number one, those tools were talking together, and number two, those tools didn't have any information coming from the product to help better qualify leads. I realized with just a little bit of work with my development team, like less than a week, I could unlock a ton more insight and make that sales leader's team way more efficient. And so that was the first thing I prioritized. Even though I saw really great low-hanging fruit in the product itself, I said, I need to build this. We need to build this. The team was kind of on the fence. We did the thing. The sales leader was like, I get it. I get it. You're using the product. I'm bought in. Let's go for this. And it made things so much easier than me having to run these experiments in isolation, prove it to them. It's how can I show you the value that I can offer to the organization? I've done it for finance teams with, invoicing and accounting and other things like that, with monetization and pricing. And I've done work there. But any team that you're having some of that friction with, go talk to them, interview them as a product manager, interview them as a customer, as you'd interview a customer. What kind of problems are you facing today? What's a perfect day look like to you? And typically people will say things like, well, this wouldn't happen. And you're like, well, why does that happen? And so you kind of, ask those questions, and that typically will give you kind of the low-hanging fruit to help those teams out and then ultimately build that trust.
And now you created a partner that will continue to support you later, right?
Exactly, yeah. And then when there's an executive board meeting that you're not at, and they're saying, should we invest in product-led growth? They're going, hey, I think we should. And so you actually get kind of the coalition effect, essentially, if you start prioritizing work that way.
That's great. Yeah. Phil, how can people get in touch with you?
The best way is on LinkedIn. It's probably the only place on social media that I'm actually active on. So feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a direct message. Happy to I have lots of informal chats with folks that have questions. I also consult. So if people are looking for consultancy on how do you become more product led, it's definitely not an easy undertaking. It's a company-wide shift. It's not just a small team doing a thing. And so it does definitely take time. So I definitely am willing to give some of my time because ultimately I'm secretly kind of invested in product-led growth succeeding, because that also means my career will continue to grow.
Phil, it was a great pleasure having you here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks.